non zesfenu meden olo sulupu prosoligon estitozen totelos ochronos
So in this discussion, we're going to explore a little more about the theory of the cosmos as it is today, according to Hesiod. So we'll talk a bit especially about the text of the Theogony, the birth of the gods of Hesiod, how he contextualizes his own knowledge as a poet through a discourse of divine inspiration, some of the questions of knowledge that arise from this, how do we know what we think we know? We'll look a bit at how the cosmos as we know it, the Olympian order, comes into being, and why, how Hesiod presents the reasons. This is how Hesiod begins some of the song that we'll be looking at today. And on the left-hand side here, you can see a famous painting that images Hesiod's inspiration by the Muse. The Muses are daughters of Mnemosune, or Memory, and Zeus, and they hold the music, hence Muse, and the cultural memory of ancient Greece. So Hesiod sang, "From the Muses of Helicon, let's begin our song. They hold the vast and sacred mount of Helicon. Round the violet fountain they dance on nimble feet, all round the altar of Kronos' strong child," another name for Zeus. "Once they taught beautiful song to Hesiod, while he took care of his lambs under sacred Helicon. And here is the mythos, the myth. These goddesses spoke out, the Olympian muses." So Hesiod is going to tell a story that derives from the gods through the muses. Who is Hesiod? He, first of all, to give us a little bit of context, has a name that literally means either a lover of journeys or a lover of song, depending on whether that odos in the end of his name is from the word odos for a road or ode, song. So this is either way a great name for a bird, a traveler who is also a singer of tales, a weaver of yarns of narrative. He was probably active around the 8th or 7th century BC, as we mentioned earlier. He might have been the first Greek poet to really individuate his own persona as an author. He sings, we should say perhaps, rather than writes, though many think that Hesiod was one of the first writing-oriented or literate bards in the rhapsode's epic verse, which is dactylic hexameter, 6 feet that are each long, short, short. So to give an example from the beginning of the Odyssey, "Andra moyenne pe musa polutropon hos malapola," sing to me, O muse, of that man of many ways or twists and turns, or as Emily Wilson translates it, that complicated man. But the sound you can hear is 6 feet, long, short, short, long, short, short. Don't worry, you don't have to remember that. But it's kind of fun. Hexameter means 6, and dactyl is just the Greek word for finger, which is, according to the Greeks, long, short, short. So that's the meter. Why should we care? A couple of reasons. So one is, this is a basically improv medium. Usually it's a medium in which the rhapsode or the bard is sometimes making up their story, building it out of formulas that are well known, and most of all, it's oral. So it's still embedded in a kind of culture of oral tradition. And whether or not Hesiod is literate, that is in writing, he's still deeply embedded in the soil of a collective oral tradition that's a little more like writing fan fiction and coming up with stories that are cool that different people agree on in different places. You can have a headcanon if you like. It's not a written creed. So, what's he singing? There's 2 poems that are especially associated with Hesiod that survive today, the Theogony and the Works and Days. The Theogony is about the gods and how our world got going, and the Works and Days is about how we should live in it. It's in the Theogony especially that Hesiod describes his inspiration by the Muses, so it's a natural starting point. And it's also important to look at Hesiod near the beginning of our exploration of Greek thought, because the later Greeks saw him as establishing the mythic, religious, and in many cases philosophical conventions that they still worked with hundreds of years later. Even though, again, he was doing something pretty pretty free, not necessarily establishing like a set text or rules. Okay, but back to Hesiod. Remember, he's at this point representing himself, his poetic persona, as a shepherd tending his flock under Mount Helicon, and suddenly these muses appear, these goddesses, and what do they say? Shepherds in the fields, you're bad news, you're like empty bellies. What an opening. Well, what they mean seems to be, in a way, you're empty. We're going to offer you something that fills your heart and mind, but is it true? We know how to tell many lies that seem like the truth, but we also know how to tell the truth when we choose to. This line, this introduction, is often represented as a way of seeing that Hesiod is claiming divine authority for the story he's going to tell, and that's clearly true. But there's also already a kind of problematization or questioning of the way the information arrives. We're not being asked here to set aside our critical judgment. I think we should see the story the Muses tell as true from Hesiod's point of view, as the poetic persona sees it, but the way we see it as true is going to invite interpretation, hermeneutics. That, by the way, is just from the Greek word hermeneus, which means interpreter, and you can recognize the name of the god Hermes in it, the god of interpretation. Okay, so what happens next? Zeus's daughters, quick in speech, spoke, plucked a staff, a blooming sprig of laurel, a wonder, and they gave it to me. They breathed a divine voice into me so that I can glorify what will be and what was, the future and the past, and the present in this way. They enjoined me to hymn the family of the blessed ones who are forever, but ever to sing first and last of their own selves. So that's what Hesiod will do. He sang first to the Muses, that's what we just had. Now, he's going to tell us the story, a little bit later in the Theogony, of the beginning of things, the origin of the gods. Remember that this story comes from the Muses. He wasn't there, perhaps, but that's how he knows. The truth is, he says, that chaos was the first of all to spring into being. Chaos sounds like disorder. It's like, bedroom in the morning. It's like everything out of place. But that's not what it means, nor quite in our sense of chaos theory. Chaos in Greek is closer to the etymological meaning of our word chasm. It's a big space. So to say that chaos was the first thing to spring into being is needing to be considered carefully in a few ways. One, it doesn't mean that chaos was the first thing that was necessarily, but chaos was the first thing that arose. And second, what is chaos? It's space. So one of the first things to spring into being was space. Then came Gaia, broad of breast. She is the ever steadfast base. Well, we'll find out of what in just a minute, but Gaia is solidity. She is the earth. So first there's space, then there's solidity, there's the earth. Okay, so she is the ever steadfast base of the immortals, those who hold Olympus's peak, wreathed in snows, and misty Tartarus. Misty Tartarus in the deep ground where the ways are wide. So Gaia, this sort of solid, is now going to be envisaged arising at the center of the space that chaos is, and there's highs and lows connected with Gaia. The highs, Mount Olympus, the lows, the depths of Tartarus. But that's not all. So Eros, whose beauty among the immortal gods is beyond all compare. Eros is the Greek god of love and attraction, sometimes seen as coming into being earlier than Aphrodite, sometimes later as her son. At this point, we have some basic principles to start with. We have space, we have solidity with its highs and lows, and we have love or attraction. There's a little more to say about love. Eros loosens the limbs of every god, of every human being, overpowers the insight, their thoughtful plans. This is not only a kind of poetic reflection on the power of desire and love, it's also a reflection on what's going to come next, because some of the first principles of the world will mingle in love, and that gives rise eventually to the world that we know and understand. So here's some of the next steps. From chaos, Erebos and dark night sprang into being. So out of space came Erebos, which is darkness, and Nux, the night. Then from night arose ether and day. Ether is the radiant sky, and day might not need much explanation. Hemera in Greek is the daylight. So in a way, this is an explanatory myth. Out of space comes night and day, and some of the different aspects of night and day we know. The apparent gloom of darkness, the mistiness we cannot see through, the radiant blue sky of daylight. And they cycle, they exchange places, as Hesiod later explains. So from a philosophical perspective, there's a lot to go on here. We're talking about what there is fundamentally, space, solidity, and attraction. We're talking about, in a way, what's grounded in those first principles. And we're getting to the position where we're talking about things we often experience, and we're seeing what their sources, what their etiology or explanations might be. So I'll try to depict this visually for a minute. In Hesiod's world, the first thing to come into being is chaos or space. And in the midst of the space, there arises something solid, that's Earth. And Earth has this sort of high of Mount Olympus, this low in the depths of Tartarus, and all around there's this sort of circling power of eros, of love or attraction or desire. Next, we talk about Erebos, the atmosphere of Tartarus. We talk about the night or Nux, and Aether, this bright blue sky. And that gives us the circling of day and night and much of the world that we know. So again, this is an attempt at explanation, but it's also a powerful story. Let's go on a little further with the story. So here's our familiar protagonist so far: space, chaos, Gaia, Eros. The next step is that Gaia bears starry Uranos, that's a name for the sky, her equal, that he might cover her all over. So she would be the steadfast base for the blessed gods, and she bore the vast mountains, graceful homes of goddesses. So Uranos begins the next generation after these most primordial of deities or principles. Then we find Gaia teeming more with life, with mountains. They're going to be homes for different divine beings, and as well Pontos, who's the kind of primordial sea or ocean, which is a child of Gaia's, born without love, without eros. So parthenogenesis as a term, she gives rise to Pontos by herself. It's possible that this applies to some of the earlier cases as well. It seems rather likely. So there's a little bit more to add to our picture. Uranos, the sky, has sprung into being, and Pontos, or the ocean. And at this point, we can kind of take stock of the picture. Hesiod actually gives us a measure for it. So his measuring unit is a little unusual. It's how long it takes an anvil to fall. If you stood at the top of the world at heaven, and you got out your anvil, and you dropped it, it would take 9 days and nights to fall to earth. That's a pretty long time. Now, if you were standing on Earth and you dropped your anvil again, it would take another 9 days and nights to get to Tartarus. So that's 9 plus 9 days and nights of anvil falling. That's how big your world is. I don't know if anybody's done the experiment. So let's sum up a little bit with some of the generations of the gods so far, bearing in mind what we've said about their philosophical significance as well. There's a primordial generation, that's space and Eros and Gaia. There's a kind of a first generation that follows, which includes Gaia's child Uranos. And Uranos and Gaia together give rise to the next generation. These are the Titans we talked about last time in our story about Kronos. Kronos and Rhea are some of the most famous Titans. In this generation, we also meet the sun and moon, Helios and Selene, and the great Titan Hecate, goddess of magic, among many other things, who retains her power in the later Olympian order. Kronos, pictured here, is an image of the rule of the Titans. He is the ruler of the Titans. And in a way, we can see how the fall of Kronos precipitates the beginning of the Olympian order with Zeus and Hera and the pantheon that becomes familiar, even as one of the Titans in particular, Hecate, retains her familiar influence. A lot of this story is meant to get us to the end, in a way, to get us to the point where Zeus and the Olympians hold power. There's a lot more to tell about the story. In the last episode, we talked a little bit about the battle of Zeus and Kronos. Here we've talked a little bit more about the earlier stages of the story, the primordial order. One thing that sometimes draws attention is how much space Hesiod spends on describing the role of the Titan Hecate. And in fact, there's a whole passage that's sometimes called his hymn to Hecate. She's pictured here bearing torches from a red figure vase that depicts her quite clearly. This is a little bit of Hesiod's so-called hymn to Hecate. Phoebe, her mother, came to Koios' lovely bed, their Titans. Phoebe's name means the shining one. And she conceived and bore Hecate, she who Zeus, Kronos' son, gave honor or time to beyond all. He gave her shining gifts to hold a share of earth and unplowed sea, and she holds a share in the honor of the starry sky too, and she is honored in the highest by the immortal gods. Of all who sprang into being from Gaia and Uranos and received honor, she holds her share of all these. Nor did Kronos' son use force against her or take from her anything that she received among the Titans, that earlier generation, gods who were before her, but she holds still as the division was first made at the origin. She stands in strength at the side of whoever she chooses and helps. So these are excerpts from Hesiod's Theogony from about 404 to 425. So it's a really extended passage, and it's interesting, and it might represent something of a personal relationship that Hesiod has to Hecate on some scholars' view. So this story so far has told us how we got here to the Olympian order. We had the primordial stage with Chaos and Gaia and Eros, then Uranos and Gaia together brought about the Titans. The Titans brought about the Olympians, but first there's some struggle. There's also struggle between Kronos and his father Uranos, which we're not discussing here. After all this, under the Olympian order, which remains stable, human beings arise. And we're aided by another of the Titans, incidentally, Prometheus, who provides us with fire, symbolizing technology and resources. Human beings develop through several ages in Hesiod. The Golden Age, which is peaceful and generally wonderful, and the earth gives of her own abundance freely. The Silver Age, not so great in many ways. The Bronze and Heroic Ages, which are full of, well, heroism and adventure and battle, but not as peaceful or ideal as the Golden Age, and the Iron Age that we live in today, which Hesiod is not impressed with at all, an age of self-interest, hubris, and violence. Hubris, which means a kind of an overweening arrogance or a willingness to trample on the dignity of the weak and others, is a feature for Hesiod of the present age from his point of view. That was much less present in the Golden Age. The cycle of divine change that characterized the shift from the primordial gods to the Titans to the Olympians ends with Thetis and Peleus, who are the parents of Achilles. It ends because there's a prophecy that if Zeus has a child with Thetis, a goddess, that child will overthrow him, as he overthrew Kronos, as Kronos overthrew Uranos. Rather, Thetis is married by the gods to a mortal person, and there's lots of different interesting ways of looking at that part of the story. This mortal person is Peleus. So instead of having a child who's a god who could overthrow Zeus, Thetis and Peleus have a human child who is the greatest of the heroes of his age, Achilles. And we'll talk about Achilles next time. Achilles kind of represents the hinge from the world of gods to humans in this sense, that the stability of the order of gods is bought in a way with the birth of Achilles. So with that, we draw a line under the order of the gods. There's some other versions of this story. In Orphic myth, for example, Zeus's son Dionysus is slain by the Titans, who are then struck by Zeus's thunderbolt. Humans arise from the ashes. That's why we carry both divine and titanic natures, according to the myth. So there's something beautiful and simple about us, and there's also something darker. Dionysus, however, is subsequently restored to immortal life, and he succeeds Zeus peacefully. So on that Orphic story, there is another generation of rulership among the gods. But in the story we know from Hesiod, generally the rule of Zeus is stable. So that takes us through a review of the theogony, how there's knowledge by divine inspiration, some of the questions of the status of that divine inspiration, the questions we can ask about its sources, and how Hesiod knows. We've talked about the origin of the cosmic principles, and next we're going to spend some time to talk about the nature of the present Olympian order that we live under.
Nos sons esfer